Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As timely and well received as a retroactive therapeutic use exemption, this is the Fights Gone By podcast. I'm your boy, critics' darling, and eternally snubbed by the Academy, Leonardo DiGrappio, Jack Slack. And it's been a little while since we caught up. I did the podcast very early last week, and I've had to leave it quite late this week. Not as late as I sometimes do them, but still quite late. Not a bad weekend, actually. I've been jokingly referring to this as the MMA off-season, because the events on have been subpar, especially the one pay-per-view of the year so far, UFC 208. But this weekend's action wasn't bad, actually, and I didn't have to watch Felder get knocked out by a legitimate heavyweight, which is always a bonus. Speaking of which, let's do some news. The most interesting thing that jumped out at me this week was one of, I think it was Jackson Winklejohn's coaches, announcing that the UFC apparently are no longer sending fight tape to coaches. They are advising them to get a Fight Pass subscription. And I like Fight Pass. I've always had the bosses at Fightland pay for it, but it doesn't have all the fights on. You know, if you wanted all of someone's fights in the UFC, there's a good chance that one of them's missing on any fighter who's had a good few fights there. You know, probably every gym should have a Fight Pass subscription anyway, just to study old fights and shit like that. But I think if you want this sport to keep getting better, and you're denying the coaches the access to the footage, that's just really dumb. What else? Cyborg gets a retroactive therapeutic use exemption for her, what was it, spironolactone? Spironolactone, which is a masking agent. I mean, some people have argued that it's a very inefficient masking agent, but this is MMA. We still hit tires with sledgehammers and use old school steroids in our cheating. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if she used this as a masking agent. Therapeutic use exemptions, generally fairly divisive anyway. Retroactive therapeutic use exemptions, normally bullshit. Or at least questionable. I mean, you can watch the spaz out in the aftermath of Thomas Hauser talking about the Floyd Mayweather late IV or whatever it was. People still go back and forth on that. It's bullshit. But to be honest, Floyd Mayweather, the amount of money he's got, probably going to be taking space-age drugs that no one can detect, if he does. Lots and lots of ins and outs, mainly outs at the UFC this week. All change in most of the divisions. Some very, very questionable ones. And, you know, people are saying that a lot of these aren't cuts. They're just letting people go in renegotiations. But, you know, this didn't happen all that often before the WME takeover. So it suggests that their negotiation tact has changed with their financial circumstances or refocus or whatever. But some very peculiar guys they didn't opt to re-sign. I mean, you remember Lawrence Larkin was that a couple of months ago? But Serkinov, Krylov, those guys are going to be fairly important in the future because, one, they're Russian. If you ever want to put Khabib at the top of a card, stack it out with Serkinov and Krylov in fights further down, you're laughing. But also, the light heavyweight division is dire. There's very few people. They've just let Bader go, who's like the consensus number 4 guy there. And now you've got 2 guys who are up-and-coming prospects. You know, definitely not complete articles. I think I was watching Krylov's fights the other day. Coming into his own, but still very clumsy in a lot of areas. But equally, you need those guys around because the division, you know, now Shogun is ranked at like number 6. And Shogun, I mean, does anyone think that he's a top fighter anymore? And Rashad Evans was ranked for 2 years in the top 5 based on a win over Chael Sonnen. And he got a gimme against Little Nog and managed to lose it. So light heavyweight's been bad for a while. So I don't know why they're getting rid of these young prospects. And there's been people around for ages saying that the UFC doesn't want anything to do with Russian fighters or Russia, which I always thought was weird. But they got, you know, Khabib and they got the Dagestanis. But this doesn't help that they just released like 2 of their better Russians in the space of 2 weeks or whatever it was. Valerie Turner was cut, I believe. And she had a little bit of a rant, I think that was today, just talking about how attitudes are changing with fighters in the UFC, how they're feeling a bit hard done by since the Reebok deal, since the WME folks came in. And then the one that was really egregious was Kyoji Horiguchi. How are you going to let the number... I think he's number 3 now, but he's easily the most promising guy at flyweight. And if he weren't buried on undercards, I think you'd have a lot more people appreciating that he's one of the most interesting strikers in MMA altogether. I think I met him when he was like 14, and he wasn't like anything special then, but I watched him develop over the years in Shuto, and then obviously later coming to the UFC, and he's just become this incredible blend of karate and box, well, like point karate and boxing. If you watch him, he bursts in with the 1-2, and then drops, moves his head, weaves up with the left hook, and catches guys on the counter. Really cool stuff. Brilliant kicking game. And if you watched his fight with Demetrius Johnson, he was giving Johnson fits on the feet. It was just that his grappling wasn't particularly good at the time. He has this problem where he gives up his back a lot and then loses half the round with the guy on his back. But he's been training at American Top Team with guys like Brownie. Your grappling's going to get better there. And he looked really good against Bagutinov. I mean, it was a close fight, but his wrestling looked really top-notch there compared to what it had been. Truly bizarre. But it really just harks back to the UFC's utter mismanagement of the flyweight division. And I harp on about this every week. People get bored of me going on about it. But if you're one of those people who's like, oh, people aren't interested in little men, blah, blah, blah. There's a difference between being bored by something and not knowing anything about it or not even seeing it, really. Think about it this way. If John Fitch got a title shot or Josh Koscheck or someone like that, and they were a boring fighter, you'd be like, God, I can't wait for the champion to starch this guy. He's so boring. The case with Demetrius Johnson is that you don't know anyone he's fighting. So you're not even rooting against them. You're just completely disinterested. You're like, oh, who's DJ fighting tonight? Because they're hidden on undercards. And then as soon as they fought Demetrius Johnson, normally rushed into the title shot. I mean, Horiguchi's a perfect example. Didn't fight a single top 10 guy thrown into a title shot because they needed to. And then immediately back onto the undercard. You know, you couldn't devise a better way to spend money on a flyweight division and waste it completely. Wilson Hayes, I was moaning about the other week. He was granted a title shot at Demetrius Johnson. Johnson got injured. They scrapped the title shot, decided to put Johnson against the winner of the Ultimate Fighter. Tim Elliott gave him a really good fight. That was a really fun one, actually. But Wilson Hayes was suddenly back on the undercard against a guy who'd won one fight since 2014. Nobody is ever going to care about anything that happens in that division if it all happens on undercards in front of like 20 people in the arena. But with all the cuts the UFC's making, and renegotiation or failure to re-sign or whatever it is, makes you think they're trying to save some money, but equally they're trying to put more belts in so that they can have more pay-per-views. So, I don't know, they're going to have to rethink how they do the flyweight division, either by removing it altogether or actually promoting it. Rant about that over, and then there were a couple of recent retirements too, which speaks to sort of the disinterest of fighters. I suppose since they've lost all their sponsorships and things like that, it's a lot less financially viable and a lot less attractive to get hit in the head for money when you're making considerably less money. So I think it was Felipe Nova, James Monsuri. I think there were a couple of others this week. But yeah, just interesting that all these guys are making big career change-ups around the same time. And finally, Fedor versus Mitrione was cancelled. Matt Mitrione has kidney stones, which you don't want to wish on anyone. They're supposed to be one of the most painful things you can endure. Passing a shard of whatever it is, carbon through your penis. And it was very interesting because the line shifted at the last minute, so people had obviously leaked the information that Mitrione was in the hospital. The commission called it off. I've seen people congratulating Bellator and saying that they cared about Mitrione's safety, but I'm wondering if they would have called it off if they were fighting in one of their Indian reservations or whatever. They've shown disinterest in Mitrione's safety before because he was knocked down in his first fight in Bellator, and they scheduled him to fight a month later, specifically avoiding anywhere that would give him a medical suspension for getting knocked over. And then, of course, there's things like the Cyborg fight. You know, Cyborg took 150 or whatever it was unanswered shots to the head, getting TKO'd. A month later, they have him fight MVP, and that's the skull-smashing performance, the last of his career. You know, there was no time for Cyborg to respect any sort of medical suspension there for getting knocked out with 100 strikes to the head, because he had to immediately turn around and get ready for MVP. That's how Bellator rolls. But, yeah, you don't want to see anyone fighting if they're not in shape to fight. I didn't want to see Fedor fighting altogether, but the number of people who were interested in this fight, like they hadn't seen how bad Fedor had looked against Maldonado, and over the last few years generally, really surprised me. Like, people thinking that he's going to come back from basically getting knocked out by Maldonado to beat a legitimate world-class heavyweight. Someone took issue with me calling him a world-class heavyweight, Mitrione, and I was like, can you name 20 heavyweights better than him? Like, that's what world-class means. If you're beating most of the heavyweights in the world, then you're a world-class heavyweight. And then they linked me the Fight Matrix rankings for heavyweight, and I went through them, and they got King Mo and Rampage ranked at heavyweight. Just awful. Yeah, well, that's news. We'll move on now. Recaps from this weekend. Gavin Tucker versus Sam Cecilia. This is the one everyone's asking me to talk about. Gavin Tucker comes from like someplace in Newfoundland. Great film about that place with Brendan Gleeson. I can't remember what it's called, but I love anything with Brendan Gleeson in. Yeah, Gavin Tucker versus Sam Cecilia. I thought I was impressed by Tucker. I was also equally unimpressed by Sam Cecilia, because you don't want to put too much on a guy if he's losing. But at no point did Cecilia try anything different. 0 takedowns attempted, just kept walking forward and landed 2 strikes per round. Tucker was doing some nice stuff. Lovely darting left hand out into a orthodox stance and then skipped up into a left high kick. Loved that. He was also doing a lot of bouncing to the inside of Cecilia's lead foot and throwing up the left high kick from there. The left kick from the inside angle, favourite of Anthony Pettis. But again, not an awful lot I can tell you about him because Cecilia did so little to trouble him. Just sort of followed him around slowly and allowed him to bounce around and get out of range again. Main event, Travis Browne versus Derrick Lewis. Travis Browne looked the best he'd looked in years by completely eschewing his boxing game and throwing kicks. I don't know if he's still with Edmund, but by not doing any boxing, he was doing great. I mean, obviously, you'd rather see him setting stuff up than just throwing the long kicks over and over again and gassing out in 2 minutes, but certainly not a bad start to the fight. And he's got the front kicks that'll wind anyone at heavyweight. Derrick Lewis just took the punches as he always does, or kicks rather. Finally, Browne ended up too close, got hammered, ended up underneath him, got hammered some more, ended up on the fence, got hammered some more, and then got knocked down by a big punch that caught him just on the forehead, and people were like, wow, the power of Derrick Lewis put him down with a punch to the forehead. You're like, well, no, he'd taken like 20 or 30 clean blows in the clinch and on the ground up to that point, and then a terrible stoppage. And then a weird post-fight speech where Derrick Lewis defended women and then objectified one in the same sentence. I mean, just standard heavyweight dreck, really. I mean, there's not a lot I can tell you about it. I will say the whole hating on Travis Browne for the accusations of domestic abuse thing, I'm uncomfortable with it, because like, he never went to court, was never charged with anything. And there are people, and I know this, some of these people who hate Travis Browne for that and want to see him hurt for that are the same people who love Humble Rumble, who's been accused like 3 different times and then had that very famous outburst against a woman in the gym for putting her yoga mat too near him. But, MMA fans are strange. I would say, if you're Derrick Lewis, or anyone, to be honest, why would you drag that in? Like, if you watched the MMA in New York debate, this domestic violence thing kept coming up like it was caused by MMA, like it was just part and parcel. You'd be better off just not mentioning it at all, I think, rather than saying, oh, look, this guy is accused of it. I beat him for everyone sitting at home. Best fight of the night was easily Paul Felder versus Alessandro Ricci. Both guys did amazing work in that fight, setting traps, throwing counters, using their bodies as bait. Best fight on the card, and I wrote about that one rather than any of the others. I'm trying to do this a little bit more nowadays. I've already got a following, so I thought, why not just actually write about the fight that interests me, rather than trying to put a technical spin on Travis Browne versus Derrick Lewis. I did it with Cerrone versus Masvidal and Angela Hill versus Jessica Andrade too. Seemed to be very well received, and it's always nice to get messages from those fighters because they appreciate getting the attention, because a lot, each of those was the best performance on the card, and they would somehow get overlooked in a lot of articles. And then Bellator-wise, their main event was Pitbull versus Thompson. That was put together like 4 weeks ago. I remember saying it on the podcast and saying, oh, that's a bit soon. But it became their main event after Mitrione versus Fedor was cancelled. And I thought Pitbull looked sharp. This is Patricky, the less accomplished Pitbull, the more knockoutable Pitbull. But Thompson has always done these interesting runs into trips and stuff like that. He's a wily vet. You know, if you wanted to show people how to set up trips and stuff on the feet, you'd show him Josh Thompson. But it was foreshadowed early on. He would run to get the trip, and he'd run face first onto Frere's head. And Frere wasn't, projecting his forehead or the top of his head, a la Evander Holyfield, or Derrick Campos is the very famous one in MMA. It wasn't a nodder. It was just that Thompson was running onto his head. It was really strange. Second round, well, actually he gets knocked down off a kick in the first round, but in the second round, Thompson runs in, stuns himself on Pitbull's head, gets knocked down, and then immediately gets up and ducks in on a really obvious, not set up, bend forward at the waist takedown, because he was probably hurt. Eats an uppercut, and it's just out. Unfortunate, people were talking about maybe appealing the result. You're going to struggle with one like that. But it still stuns me that Melvin Gillard's team didn't ever appeal the Derrick Campos one, because the headbutt was vital to the knockout in that fight. Anyway, it wasn't too much going on this weekend, but not a bad weekend of fights. Let's do some mail. Hey Jack, big fan of your work and wondering what's your opinion of the technique of Cyborg. I've seen the notion that she's some amazing technician thrown around quite frequently, and was wondering if there's any truth to this. All my untrained eye can manage to see is a fighter who usually has a massive size/strength advantage, swarms the smaller person with overwhelming pressure, and a sloppy whirlwind of attacks that a real technician of similar size could take advantage of. I'm not saying she's bad, or even that she has bad technique, but I can't recall any of it being on display, at least not recently. Also, what do you think of the idea that she's the best female fighter ever? I'm not necessarily saying I disagree, but in my opinion it's not so open and shut considering the previously mentioned size advantage, in addition to her crushing quote-unquote cans for the better part of a decade. Sorry for the long question, appreciate all the hard work you do to point out the nuance and genius of the sport to us. Cheers. That's from Nick. Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article about Cyborg a little while ago. It was before her last fight, and basically I had to go back and watch all her recent fights because I'd only drifted in and out of her career since the Gina Carano fight. And she has improved. Like, she did used to just be a windmilling mess of a fighter who was much stronger than her opponents. She's started putting in body work. She throws straights a lot more often now. Not all the time, obviously, because she still likes to windmill. But kicking game seems to have gotten better. And also she's much better on the counter too. She'll wait for her opponent to lead. She won't just run in all the time, always. Having said that, best female fighter ever. I don't know. I mean, like, it goes back to this whole skill versus accomplishment debate. In the same way that Derrick Lewis is a better fighter than Demetrius Johnson, because if they fought, he'd win. Just because he has a nearly 200-pound weight advantage or whatever it is. There are plenty of fighters in the lower weight divisions of women's MMA who are better technically, strategically, whatever you want to say, better fighters skill-wise than Cyborg. A lot of her game is being beastly strong and being able to hit very hard, which is very rare in the women's divisions. If you look at Cyborg's record, the only real names are Gina Carano, who had also fought a lot of, mainly people who competed one or two weight classes lower and were asked to get up to 145 to fight her. Then there's a big break, and then the other big name on there is Marlis Kunin. Marlis Kunin, second best featherweight ever. Not actually a featherweight, fights at bantamweight quite comfortably. If Marlis Kunin weren't on Cyborg's record, the best name on there would be Leslie Smith. I mean, you can say she beat Charmaine Tweet and things like that, but if you've seen Charmaine Tweet fight, not a terrifically skilled fighter in terms of ability. So the thing with Cyborg is that she benefits enormously from being in an incredibly weak division, but she also suffers enormously from being in that division because the UFC won't give her fights, or wouldn't even consider the division until lately. And now it looks like she might not get back, or whatever. Since I started recording this podcast, actually, a news alert has come up that Cyborg didn't actually reveal she'd taken this banned substance until after she was caught. Oh well, whatever with all that nonsense going on. Next question. Mr. Slack. With GSP finally making his return to the Octagon, who stylistically would make a good fight for him if he decides to make his return at 155, as Dana White mentioned was a potential option? Cheers. Tim. Don't believe his lies. Straight off the bat. Never ever believe anything Dana White says, especially regarding GSP, because I feel like we've done this. GSP is imminently returning about 3 times now. Stylistically, well, depends if you mean like stylistically good for GSP or stylistically good for the fans. For GSP, give him Nate Diaz. Watch him crush another Diaz or lay on another Diaz for 3 rounds. And then you'd instantly be able to say, oh, title contention, get him in with Conor McGregor. Be interesting to see him against Khabib, because Khabib's a massive lightweight, size-wise, but very rudimentary on the feet, so could Khabib take him down, or would GSP jab him up? I'd love to see that one play out over 5 rounds. Rafael Dos Anjos is a really interesting one in my noggin, but I don't want to put Rafael Dos Anjos in another really, really hard fight, because if he loses, people will go, oh, he's lost it, as opposed to he's fought 3 really hard guys in a row. Yeah, I think for me, Khabib's the most interesting one, because he's just so strong and so good in the clinch. And such a brilliant wrestler, and that's been GSP's strength all along, and it'd be interesting to see if he could get him down. The other thing about the RDA matchup is that GSP, no like the southpaws, if you remember Johnny Hendricks, as soon as he started covering that lead hand, GSP had nothing on the feet. He'd been getting by on his jab for so long, he'd suddenly forgotten how to do everything else. A good matchup in terms of like a tune-up, I think maybe someone with a bit of a reach disadvantage and someone who would want to fight on the feet and would have to try and stop the takedowns. So maybe Eddie Alvarez or Tony Ferguson would be an interesting one, actually, because that would get him right into title contention off the bat. Anyway, cheers, Tim. Sorry, that question was from Tim. I don't remember if I said. Dear Jack, love your podcasts. They are amazing. Listen to every single one and wish they were longer. Oh, thank you. Could you recommend me a book that I could gift a friend who is into kickboxing? He's small and a southpaw. The book could either be instructional or a biography, though it would be great to have a good read and not too expensive, like up to 40 quid maybe, ? That would be much appreciated. He got me a rash guard, but he has full gear, so not sure what else to get him. Best regards, Justin. The one I always recommend, and actually I have gifted this a couple of times. If you can find it cheap secondhand online, Edwin Hazlett on Boxing, or Boxing by Edwin Hazlett. Terrific book. But you've all heard me sing that praise way too many times already. Anderson Silva's book I've revisited recently, and it isn't that bad, actually. The Victory Belt one. You can probably get that for about 30 quid. Good person spending up to 40 quid on a friend's birthday present. I mean, I'd spend like 10 on my own family. There's a really good karate, full contact karate style one called the Sabaki Method. The striking stuff in Fedor's book's pretty interesting. Muay Thai Unleashed, another Victory Belt one. Good fun. I'm a big fan of Masahiko Tanaka's Perfecting Kumite. That's going to be more of a point fighting karate one, but something you can apply to kickboxing. They now sell Bruce Lee's Fighting Method, all 4 books in one hardback, which is a really good one. I think you can probably get that for 20-something quid. If he's not read The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, that's a all-time classic. Or if you're feeling particularly spiritual, just get him Musashi's Book of 5 Rings. Plenty to be going on with there. Hey Jack, big fan. You already answered some of my questions on Twitter. My question today is, why don't we see hand-controlled enclosed guard matchups using the rear hand to control the lead hand? From Justin. That's an interesting one, actually. I think it's because it doesn't go in with the style of kickboxing that most people are learning at their MMA gym. You'll see it a lot more in Muay Thai because those guys train their elbows almost as much as they do their hands and legs. You're looking for elbows and knees all the time. So the hand checking and hand fighting becomes a much bigger deal. it seemed for a while like it was going to become a bigger portal of the fight. I think it was Johnny Hendricks and Robbie Lawler, their first fight, then Machida and Weidman, and there was a John Jones one as well, all in a short space of time where the hand fighting at sort of touching range played a huge part of the fight. But if you've got guys in the gym every day hitting the pads and remembering to bring their hands back to their chin or their guard every time, it's going to be a little bit rarer for them to be putting their hands out in front of them and leaving their jawline feeling all naked. But there's a few guys out there who are doing it well. Matt Brown, John Jones, obviously, Chris Weidman, Jordan Mean, he's back now, yay. Yeah, it's catching on. I mean, just more sort of traditional Muay Thai stuff. Not so much Dutch kickboxing style or boxing. Though, if you watch the Jack Johnson episode we did a little while back, you'll notice him trapping the lead hand constantly and throwing his. Hey Jack, huge fan. As you know, the Fedor fight got cancelled this weekend. What are the odds that in future they scrap the Mitrione fight altogether and give Fedor an easier scrap with a fighter with a crap record, or maybe a fight in the Legends division? Thanks again, love your work, Joey. Yeah, apparently Sonnen was looking to take the fight on short notice. But, you know, I don't... As much as I think Fedor's done, I don't like that fight for Sonnen because he's not a particularly big hitter. And if he's just taking Fedor down over and over again, he's giving Fedor a lot of chance to throw out one of those arm bars or scramble back up and start hitting. It's important to remember that Fedor already fought someone with a fairly mediocre record in Fabio Maldonado, and still looked appalling, because all he does now is come to swing, and he doesn't have the chin for it anymore. But he was saying after the fight that it was God's will that he didn't get the fight, or something like that, or that well, basically he was saying it was God's will that Matt Mitrione got kidney stones. But you know, if he does believe that that's God's will, maybe he'll take this as a sign to stop fighting altogether. Certainly there's more important things that Mitrione could be doing in terms of his position in like the worldwide heavyweight rankings. A win over Fedor isn't going to get you much in the eyes of fans who've been following the sport for a long time. Well, actually, anyone who knows who Fedor is probably wouldn't treat a Mitrione victory as much anyway. It'd be more interesting to see... Who the hell is Bellator's heavyweight champion? Is it Chet Congo? Or Minakov? I don't remember. But, you know, it'd be more interesting to see them try and get some quality heavyweights for Mitrione to fight. If they really want to give Fedor a win, get him in with Ken Shamrock or someone like that. You know, Legends division all the way. But again, you don't want another rumour of a rigged fight, and that's what happens when you have 40-year-old, 50-year-old dudes at the top of a card full of 20-year-olds. You know, it looks really bad. And it confuses people who don't understand why that would look that bad. Jack, the Holm versus Durandamy fight, oh good, we get to talk about this again, got me thinking about UFC draws in the UFC. It would have been a complete disaster for the inaugural women's featherweight belt to be awarded to absolutely fucking nobody. So in order to address this problem, I was thinking about how plausible it would be for championship fights to go an extra round in the event of a draw, a la Thai boxing. I don't think the fighters would object in principle, other than maybe Tyron Woodley. Objection is sort of his thing, and I can't think of any real reason not to implement this change. What is your take on this? Keep up the good work and cheers, from Aaron. Yeah, if you remember, BJ Penn and Kowluno fought for the UFC lightweight title, and they went to a draw, and rather than doing a rematch, the UFC just said, fuck it, and didn't book any more lightweight fights for the next 3 years. Which you kind of hope would happen with this women's featherweight division, because after Cyborg fights for the title and either wins or loses, what else is there to do? I don't know about adding an extra round. I believe that most states that you would want to fight in have a limit on the number of minutes a fighter can be in the cage on each night, because that's the problem they always have when they bring up tournaments. If you remember the Yama, which was absolutely dreadful, and I think WSOF wanted to do a tournament at one point, and then they found out this rule and they had to walk it back. But basically, a fighter, I think it's 25 minutes is like the most a fighter can fight in one night, in either Nevada or California or somewhere. So Yama had to do one 5-minute round for each of the first round fights, one 5-minute round for each of the second round fights, and then a 3-round fight for the tournament final. So basically, you just got guys laying on each other for 2 minutes to win the first round, and that was it. But I to be honest, the more 5-round fights I see, the more convinced I am that if we had 5-round fights, there would almost always be a finish, and that most divisions could benefit from that. You turn it into an attrition contest rather than 15 minutes of trying to get points. Suddenly, 2 takedowns can win you 2 takedowns and a bit of blanketing can win you a 3-round fight. A little bit harder in a 5-round fight because you've got to keep pushing for 25 minutes. A 7-round fight sounds absolutely mental, but I would love to see one happen. Be very interesting, for a title fight. But the 5-round thing, we have the odd number of rounds because it makes it harder to score a draw. If a draw's scored after 5 rounds, it's probably, deserving of being a draw because they so rarely happen anyway. Pride used to do this extra round stuff, and K1 actually, they used to do that as well. And they used to do it when the Japanese fighter looked a little bit... do you remember the Guy Mezger versus Sakuraba one? And Ken Shamrock was in Guy Mezger's corner. And Guy Mezger had done a really good job in that fight. And they said, extra round. And, Guy Mezger could have gone the extra round and won the fight. But Ken Shamrock, in his corner, threw a fit and said, nope, go to the back. And Guy Mezger just did that. The other one was Buakar versus Masato. Buakar got the better of him over, I think it was 3 rounds, and they said extra round, so Buakar just kept going and beat him up again. Yeah, extra rounds, it sounds like a good idea, but you're getting to the long end of what should be physically possible for a fighter. You'll have been fighting half an hour if you get into the end of the extra round. And it comes down to, basically, problems with judging altogether. There's no system of judging where there aren't going to be unsatisfactory results. We just sort of have to take them and run with it. In fact, that's the UFC's job. They have to take the unsatisfactory results and run with it. We can't keep putting in measures to make sure that draws don't happen while encouraging referees to score more 10-8 and 10-10 rounds, which they should be. I hate seeing a guy, an evenly matched round and they give it 10-9 to one guy. And then the next round is a little bit more convincing, one guy wins, and that's also a 10-9. There's got to be some kind of context to what a 10-9 and a 10-10 are. But we'll never be happy with the judging system, so it's best not to ruminate on it too much and get caught up. Hey Jack, huge fan of the Fightland articles and of course your podcast. Question: there seems to be a large amount of the UFC fighters pulling out of fights in recent years, i.e. Team AKA, Kane, DC and Rockhold. Don't forget Habib, he's there. Ian McCall, Jose Aldo, Dom Cruz, etc. Ian McCall is a real rough one. He can't catch a break. He's had opponents pull out, opponents get sick, opponents miss weight, all sorts of things. I recently heard Bazooka Joe Valtellini speaking about how he never did any road work, running of any kind, just sprints once or twice per camp. The rest of his training was lightweight lifting, 1 training session a day, shadow boxing for cardio, and rarely did full contact sparring. I've heard many MMA fighters in camps state that they don't do as much sparring as they did in previous years, but still plenty of other camps praise the benefits of road work, powerlifting, and full contact sparring. Do you believe MMA fighters are prone to overtraining? And if so, what are some things that you would change about training camps to prevent injuries? P.S. Our movement coaches bullshit, from Ian. Anytime someone asks about different training styles, it's very important to make clear that there has been there's not a consensus on training, because if it were very clear that one method of training was always superior, all the camps would be doing the same thing. So there are benefits to not sparring as hard as often, and then there are benefits to sparring hard lots. People like Verdum, I don't think he'd have gotten as comfortable as he is on the feet. I'm not going to say, technical, because he's a little bit slappy sometimes, but I don't think he'd been able to get comfortable in such a short period of time if he hadn't been at a camp that spars fairly hard, fairly often. But this is the same with everything. There have been world champion boxers who only spar in the month up to their fight, and there are world champion boxers who sparred almost every day and refused to do anything else, like James Toney. knees, shoulders, and elbows tend to be the most frequent injuries you hear about, and they're the sort of things that come about in grappling a lot of the time too. Grappling is something that you can do every day if you so choose and you are in condition to do it, but equally it does take a huge amount of wear and tear on the body. You're not going to get to a decent level in grappling without taking some time off, forced time off due to injuries at some point. What you said about Valtellini saying that he does his one training session a day and shadow boxing for cardio makes me think of what people have told me about Cuban teams. Apparently a lot of Cuban gyms do rounds and rounds and rounds of shadow boxing, and then a little bit of like light sparring, just playing for openings and stuff. Well, we talked about Gentleman Jim the other day. We were saying he did an hour of shadow boxing every day. That's just an insane amount of shadow boxing to do. But shadow boxing is an exercise which can either be very useful or completely useless. If you're shadow boxing like Ronda Rousey, this isn't just about her form. This is about the fact that her actual fighting style was nothing like her shadowboxing style. She was throwing hundreds of short punches and showing, rapid hand movement, and then she'd come out and throw 1-2s, and that was it. If you're not going to be in range long enough to throw long combinations, then why would you bother doing them in shadowboxing except just to look good and make noises? Whereas if you watch some of like Bernard Hopkins, if you watch him shadowbox, it's not always full speed, but he's always going through like the full motions, and he's moving his feet, and it's actually like he's boxing without an opponent. I think footwork guys who use a lot of footwork and in and out movement are going to benefit tons from more shadowboxing. I don't know if guys who like to fight on the inside and things like that are going to benefit more from that than they would spending more time on the double end bag or the slip bag or training more on the mitts and things like that. I think it all depends on what you want to do with your style or what kind of style you fall into. The one training method that everyone can benefit from is sparring, basically, because you're all training for that. That is the exercise that you are training for. I've heard some interesting theories. Actually, it was coming out of rugby more recently, that because players are getting bigger and training more, doing more weight training and things like that, they're actually suffering more injuries than in the old days where they just used to play rugby, and that's basically all they did, maybe go for a few runs. Not so much bearing in a MMA fighters aren't getting bigger because they've got weight classes in, and plenty of smaller fighters get injured the same way. But even road work, running is terrible for your knees and ankles because you're slamming your weight into them over and over again for thousands of repetitions at a time. And then cycling, it shortens all your muscles. I think anything you do, the basic consensus is if you're using your body for physical activity, you're going to suffer wear and tear. It's just something you have to deal with. I think in terms of serious injuries, the things that can cut it down are things where you can't predict the range of motion you're going to be put through, so sparring, or at least hard sparring. I mean, more light sparring is always a good option because it allows you to practice your movements against a resisting opponent, or rather someone who wants to deny you those opportunities, as opposed to someone who's trying to take your head off while you're looking for those opportunities. Yeah, I think cutting down on the heavy sparring and maybe to touch on the movement coach thing, actually, when that came up a while ago, my reaction was, if you're doing something fairly active as a fighter and it's something where you're not going to get hurt, and whether it works or not, the objective is to try and teach your body to stay in ranges of motion that it can comfortably deal with without putting ligaments and shit in danger. Even if it doesn't work, the idea there is one that should be supported, I suppose. Anything a fighter can do that is actively training but is reducing the chances of him getting hurt, probably for the best, or probably at least worth a look. Ended up getting a bit rambly there, but cheers, Ian. Right, I reckon that'll do us for questions today. We might do some more later in the week. fightsgoneby@gmail.com. Getting so many nowadays, it's fantastic. I'm going to try and answer more and more. Maybe throw out some extra podcasts and just for questions and answers like I did a couple of weeks ago. In terms of fights this weekend, we don't have anything from the UFC. We've got UFC 209, which is looking really good, coming March 4th, so weekend after. Bellator are putting on Magiri. Oh, wait, what? This has changed. Yeah. When I was looking at this yesterday, this was Magiri versus Filipovic, and I was like, what? And I clicked on it, and it's some other Filipovic that you've never heard of, doesn't have a great record, and, you look at it and going, did they just put him at the top of the card so that they can have Filipovic in the headline? But apparently he's out now, so Liam Magiri, 11-1, legitimate light heavyweight, probably on the edge of the top 15 in the world still, versus now Brett McDermott, 7-4. So look forward to that. Oh, apparently they changed his opponent twice already. Oh, so his original opponent was an SBG middleweight who has one win since 2012. So it looks like they're trying to get Liam Magiri back on the winning track. Wow, okay, so Filipovic was a better opponent than the guy he was originally supposed to fight, and then they brought in a third opponent who is worse. Very strange. I think it's this weekend that James Gallagher's fighting on that card, is it? Yeah, James Gallagher 5-0 versus a guy who's 7-3 but has one win in his last 5 fights. In fact, he's not 7-3. I'm on the Sherdog record right now. He's actually 7-4. There's a fight at Kunlun in China that has been dropped from his Sherdog record for some reason. But the James Gallagher thing's very weird. They're definitely trying to build their own sort of McGregor over there in Bellator. Last time they gave him a guy who was 1-6 as an amateur, 1-2 as a pro. Guy's talking all kinds of smack, and you're just like, I'd believe this more if you were fighting better opponents. And then Sinead Kavanagh is okay, it's in Belfast, so they're getting the SBG guys up there. Even though it's Northern Ireland, I suppose you're going to have plenty of people who know them. And James Gallagher is apparently from Northern Ireland. And it's a 4-fight card. Interesting. To be fair, I've been arguing that the UFC should do this for ages. I mean, if they didn't already have tons of debt and weren't desperately, scrambling to try and get some meaningful fights together or slap belts on whatever events they can, I thought a while ago it would be a good idea for the UFC just to invest in a venue in Vegas and run a 4-fight card every week. Get drunk people in to watch the fights. 4 fights, that's not going to be hard to find people to fight in, and it would certainly be easier to fill up their TV deals. And if they are struggling for TV time, they could just whack on a couple of the fights previously recorded from like last week's fights. Yeah, it's still in the idea phase, but if they start doing that now, you'll know it was old Slacky's idea. Anyway, I reckon that'll do us for this week. Tip of the week, go see La La Land. I watched it the other day. I went into the cinema being like, oh, Oscar bait wank, blah, blah, blah. Scowling the entire time. First 20 minutes, I was like, this is shit. And then at some point, it just charmed me. Might have been Ryan Gosling being incredibly sexy, or Emma Stone looking, she looks ridiculous. It's no one should look like that. Stunning lass. But yeah, quite well written. Surprising ending. Wasn't all twee. Really enjoyed it. So go watch La La Land. It's decent. Oh, and I played about 2 matches of For Honor on a friend's PS4. And that's decent too. So check that out. Right, I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been Fights Gone By Podcast. Send your emails, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. New Patreon episode, I think next week. We're doing Jack Dempsey, and it'll be the tits. So sign up for the Patreon if you're not already involved. If you are already involved, cheers, you're helping me out. I'll catch you next week. Toodle-doo.